everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Universe Within podcast. On this episode, I sat down with Jeff Chilton. Jeff was introduced to me, and it was really serendipitous because for a long time I've been wanting to bring on someone to talk about mushrooms. And I think Jeff is really the perfect person. He's been involved in this work for, I don't know, maybe 50 years or more now. Maybe not that much, 40 or something, but he's been in it for a long time. And ever since a young age, he was working on a mushroom farm, really learning about mushrooms. And we got into a lot of really fascinating topics, talking about the nutritional aspect of mushrooms, the medicinal aspect of mushrooms, and the spiritual aspect of mushrooms, which is actually where we ended up probably spending most of our time talking. It's always something that I get really excited about when I'm able to interview someone who I think has a really deep worldview of a lot of these ancient traditions and religions and uses of these plants or mushrooms. So it was a real joy for me to have him on and talk about some of these things, topics that I find really fascinating. It's, for me, it feels like kind of like a geek out moment where I find someone who I can really talk about these things with. So it was a really big pleasure to have Jeff on. I think you all will gain a lot from this interview. I think we went close to, or maybe even a little bit over 3 hours. So I hope you all enjoy this interview. One little technical note, we shot this on Zoom, and for whatever reason, normally when I do an interview with Zoom, whoever is speaking, it records the active speaker. For whatever reason, in this interview, it didn't do that. It only recorded Jeff. Luckily, so when I'm asking the questions or in dialogue, the camera stays on Jeff, but you can still hear me talking as well, but no video. So, but fortunately, we got the video for Jeff. So I think that's it. As always, if you are able to support this podcast, that's a really big help to me. Patreon is a really good option. It's a subscription service. For as little as $1 a month, you can sign up. There's different tiers, and those tiers give you different things back, things like early access to shows, some bonus material, a chance to ask questions and get responses. To all of the people who have done that, thank you very much. As always, I deeply appreciate the support. And if you're able to do that, thank you in advance. One of the things I really like about that website is it works on this idea of Aini, of reciprocity. So if you feel like you're gaining something from these podcasts, I always really appreciate the support. There's also the ability to direct donate via PayPal, and the YouTube channel now also has an option to join, giving very similar perks to the Patreon page. So I'll put a link to all of those in the show notes. If you're not able to do that, as always, helping out with the algorithms to get the show out to a bigger audience is always a big help. So if you're viewing this on YouTube, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the video, leaving comments in the comments section, sharing the videos with friends and family, that's always a really big help. And then with the audio version on Apple Podcasts, following the show, leaving a starred rating and a short review, that's a really big help. Also, I believe with Spotify now, it gives you the option to rate the show. I think if you go on the homepage of Spotify for the Universe Within podcast, there's 3 little dots, and if you hit that, it gives you the option to rate the show. So I think that's it for the intro, and without further ado, here is my conversation with Jeff.
Running out from the maze, running out of the maze today. Running out from the maze, running out from the maze, running out from the maze today. I'm running out from the maze, running out from the maze, run out of the maze today.
Well, Jeff, it's a pleasure to have you on. We were chatting a little bit before we started recording, and thank you again for taking the time. We were just kind of noticing this beautiful view. You're coming from Tasmania, and I was mentioning one of my first teachers of plants came from Tasmania. But maybe to start, just to say a bit about you. I'm sure it's something you get a lot. Who are you? I know it's a huge question, but just to give the audience a little bit about a bit of background about you, who you are, where you came from, and really this journey that led you to working with mushrooms. As we were talking about it, it's something that, I mean, I remember as a young child learning about mushrooms, and we were kind of talking about this idea between the different aspects of mushrooms, the nutritional, the medicinal, and the spiritual, I guess you could call it. But I remember even in a nutritional sense, when I was young, I remember learning that mushrooms had no nutritional value. And even as a kid, I remember thinking, that's crazy. That doesn't make
That's
any
so
sense at
interesting.
all.
Yeah, that is so interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, grew up in Washington State, and the Evergreen State. The reason is because it rains a lot. So it actually is a perfect climate for wild mushrooms, one of the best in the world, actually. So I had mushrooms around me all while I was growing up. And then when I went to university, so I'd gotten out and done a little bit of mushroom hunting before that. When I went to university, my study was actually anthropology.
Mm.
And I also, at that point in time, look, this was in the 60s. And so I was in university from 65 to 71. And it was a very interesting time in the sense that we were challenging the status quo. And part of that was all of a sudden it was no longer, oh, gee, let's go out and drink beer. It was like, no, everybody was starting to, or a lot of us were starting to smoke cannabis and take LSD or mushrooms. And so it was a very expansive time in that sense of just experimentation. And look, one of the things that I think a lot of people need to understand about the 60s, because there's so much information, good and bad, about that period of time, but in terms of actually consuming mushrooms or LSD or something, we did not have guides. We did not have teachers. It was a very experimental time in that sense. But so this is what's going on during that period of time. And one of the things that I did is I put my anthropology together with my mushroom interest, and in a sense was studying ethno-mycology, the use of mushrooms worldwide for food, for medicine, and for religious or spiritual or healing purposes. And one of the things that had happened then was that a New York banker named Gordon Wasson, he and his wife were going around the world collating mushroom lore and mushroom use. And in the 50s, through a few reports out of Mexico, one of which was by Richard Evans Schultes of Harvard, there were reports out of Mexico that, hey, there are people down there using mushrooms that cause visions. So he went down there to the state of Oaxaca, and he was there for the next 5 years every summer, which is during the rainy season. And that's when the mushrooms are growing. So they stayed down there. They cataloged the different psychoactive species, the psilocybe mushrooms there, and they also contacted different curanderas or curanderos there and had what they called a velada with these curanderas. And what transpired from their work there, in 1957, a magazine called Life magazine, which was a very large, broad paged consumer magazine, put out an article. And it was really interesting because on the front cover of the article, it said sort of Great Adventures 3, mushrooms that cause visions discovered in Mexico. Well, think about that for a minute, Jason, in terms of a consumer mainstream magazine. And the way they treated it was, isn't this interesting? Mushrooms that cause visions. Oh my God, it's like, and that magazine article, and it was a beautiful article, maybe 10 pages long, and they had pictures in there of one of the curanderas, Maria Sabina. They had beautiful watercolors of the different mushroom species, pictures of Wasson and Roger M., the mycologist that he was working with. So that article, many people saw that, and that stimulated a whole, let's just say, revolution in people all of a sudden going, oh, mushrooms. In fact, that's where Timothy Leary actually got his first experience, was going to Mexico in the early 60s, before he started doing his further research at Harvard, and taking the mushrooms and using them down there. So all of that information worked its way back up into the universities and into the consciousness of all of us. And so, this was a time where, I don't know if you're familiar with the works of Carlos Castaneda. Well, whether or not you think he was real or not, to me, doesn't really matter, because his books were very interesting. And because of him, you had a whole generation of my generation thinking, I would love to go out and find my own Don Juan. So you had thousands of young people going to Mexico, going back up into the mountains, finding the mushrooms, looking for their own Don Juan, or in fact, looking for Maria Sabina, wanting to have that experience, which now, in a sense, I look at that and I think that was the very initial stages of what's going on now in a major way, which is, where do you go these days when you're looking for a shaman? Well, now it's totally set up. Everybody wants to go to South America. They want to take ayahuasca. They want to. Why do they want to go there? Well, they're looking for that experience with somebody who is knowledgeable, who can guide them through an experience, because they don't know where else to go in many cases, and it's certainly not for the experience that is, let's just call a real, generally speaking, depending on who you happen to end up with, right? Because it could just be, somebody out there, as trying to make money, and it's just, push them through. But that was kind of the 60s in that sense, and going to Mexico and looking for that mushroom curandera, or looking for your Don Juan, who was a Yaqui Indian, and they were using peyote for the most part and other plants. But that kind of started also. So I was right in the middle of that, and I was taking trips to Mexico during that period, and ultimately after university, I went to Oaxaca, and I lived in Oaxaca for a year and a half. Sí, por eso yo puedo hablar el español. Eso es para mí. También este estado de Oaxaca es como un hogar. I just got back from Oaxaca, actually. I was there for the last 4 months, and it is a wonderful, wonderful state with all sorts of fantastic indigenous groups that are still pretty much, still maintain a lot of their customs, which is very unusual. Look at North America. That's kind of, okay, they sort of try and go through the motions, but not like Mexico, where they're still in villages back in the mountains, still doing things the way they did it thousands of years ago. Yeah, sure, they have phones and things like that. They have cars, but it's still very much, all of that is still very similar. So at any rate, I was down there for a year and a half. I was looking for my Don Juan, so to speak. But in the meantime, what happens too is, okay, you're with a group of, I was down there alone, just traveling around, hitchhiking everywhere. It's kind of like Mexico on $2 a day, and so it was a wonderful time. Lots of interesting people were doing the same thing. I did ultimately make it up to Huautla, which was the name of the small town where Maria Sabina was, and that whole Sierra Mazateca where the mushrooms were growing. And I actually had quite a, I would say, it was a bit of a life-changing experience. But interestingly enough, it wasn't because I was taking the mushrooms up there. I took mushrooms during the whole period, but not with anybody in particular. But I had an experience up there with another Mazatec man that I had met. But then when I got back from Mexico, what do you do with a degree in anthropology, Jason? I mean, so I at that point in time, and look, during my studies at university, they were all pretty much focused on mushrooms and how, really the spiritual side of them was the big thing, because so many of us were looking for what was missing in our lives. I mean, part of the 60s was religion. It's empty. There is nothing spiritual about it. It is nothing more than rituals. So opening up ourselves and to the experience of whether it be LSD or mushrooms or peyote, that was a very big part of what was going on, and just the freedom of physically and mentally of what that meant. But coming back to the United States, I'm like, well, I would really like to learn how to grow mushrooms. Wouldn't that be so cool? I went to the only mushroom farm in Washington State in 1973. I got a job there. I was at that farm for the next 10 years, literally living with mushrooms.
Mm. So when you were growing up, when you were a boy or a young man, you said you grew up around mushrooms. Was there, I guess at that time, there wasn't an awareness that they had these other effects, these psychedelic effects or spiritual effects? Were they just seen as, I mean, do you remember from that time, were they just seen as something pretty, or you have to be careful of them because they can kill you if you eat them? Or what was at that time, kind of what was the general consensus about mushrooms? How were people looking at them?
Well, I would say for the most part, people were just kind of like very unaware of them, or even as kids, you might just kick one over if it was big enough. But I was able to go out and do some mushroom hunting with the parents of friends of mine, which kind of got me into it. A mushroom hunt is like a treasure hunt. You go out, you're in the forests. It's a beautiful environment. You're scanning the ground for mushrooms of whatever size and shape. And when you find something that is a choice edible, it is really finding a treasure, finding that little pot of gold there. So it's very satisfying and very interesting and a lot of fun. And part of it too is just getting out into the forest, getting out with nature, just being in that environment. And I feel so fortunate to have grown up in that part of the world, because we have fabulous forests there. We even have old growth forests. We have lakes and rivers. There's no shortage of water there. So it's a wonderful part of the world, and something where is always going to be I'm going to be rooted in that, and always think about how fortunate I was to grow up in a place where we had fresh air, fresh water. The water that came out of our taps in the 50s, God, Jason, it was like nectar, especially after, I mean, we would take trips in the 50s down to Los Angeles where my aunt and uncle lived, and they couldn't drink water out of the tap. Their water came in 5-gallon jugs that were delivered to them on a regular basis. And you just think about that, and you even try some of that tap water down there, and it's just horrible. Even the bottled water was really dead in a way. So you ultimately come to appreciate simple things like the taste of water.
That sounds like a silly thing, but I think for a lot of people, they probably never really tasted real water in that way. I mean, uh, uh, about maybe 10 miles from here, there's a little hot spring. It's actually kind of the end point of some very high hot springs. And there's a little pool down at the base of the mountain. And right next to there, and nobody even really sees it, they just go there for the hot spring. But right next to it, coming out of the ground, there's this little bubbling water. And if you drink it, a lot of people think you're crazy. Like, what are you doing drinking water out of the ground? You're going to get sick and you're going to die. But the maintenance guy who takes care of it, he says, no, that's a natural spring. It's coming from this pure, pristine water. And you drink it, and it's like, even that term, which we've stopped using, sweet water, that comes from drinking real water, because it's actually sweet. It has a sweetness to it that's almost undescribable to someone if they don't know
nectar.
that.
It is absolutely. I remember actually on my trip from Cuzco to the Sacred Valley that not far out of Cuzco, we stopped at a place where it was kind of built up with stone and stuff, but there was a big gushing pipe of water coming out there, and that was kind of why we stopped. It was like some naturally occurring spot where people could come and get water and so on, and it was just a real I'll sort of like never forget that, being there and seeing that, and then it was just a gusher of water coming out of this really interesting older pipe there, right out of the stone wall.
Yeah. So maybe just to clarify, I think there's some terms that get thrown around a lot, and I think sometimes there's some confusion about that. So how would you define things like, for example, a mushroom, a fungus, mycelium? I think these are all spores. I think these are all things that people hear about, and maybe we think we have an idea what they are, but I think often there's a lot of confusion. So is that something you could speak a little bit about?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, first of all, it's kind of interesting because as a mushroom grower, it's kind of like, well, how do you grow mushrooms? They don't have seeds. Where do we start here? We've got a seedless organism that we want to grow. Well, mushrooms have spores. Those spores in nature, they drift off on air currents. They land on the ground. They land on wood. They land on every. I mean, what's interesting too is that the air we breathe is filled with things we cannot see: spores, pollen, you name it, bacteria, everything. So we're breathing in that all the time. So these spores will land in various different types of organic matter. And when conditions are right, which is normally when things get moist enough, because the spore needs moisture to germinate, these spores will germinate. And they'll germinate into a very fine filament called a hypha. And when multiple of these filaments come together and fuse, they will form a network, and that network is called mycelium. And mycelium is considered the vegetative body of this fungal organism. So we're talking about a fungal organism, and in the the whole kingdom of fungi. There's so many different areas and different classifications of them. What we call mushrooms is just one arena. There's another that we know about commonly, which we would call molds. So this mycelium, this network, it is spreading. As long as it has a food source, it will spread, consuming it. Fungi are nature's recyclers. They're out there working with bugs. They're working with multiple molds. They're working with bacteria. It's a feast out there, breaking down all of this organic matter ultimately into humus. So this mycelial body, we don't normally see it because it's underground or it's embedded in a piece of wood. What we tend to see is when conditions are right, which in the Pacific Northwest is the fall. What happens in the fall? We get a lot of rain. The humidity goes up. Mushrooms, the actual mushroom needs high humidity. If it's too dry, it cannot grow because it'll dry out almost immediately. So when conditions are right, a mushroom will form, and it starts out as a very fine little, what we call a pin, and then it grows into what we call a button. So it'll go through different stages. Ultimately, we see the stem, the cap. The cap will, as it matures, expand. Underneath the cap will be gills. And on those gills, spores will be produced. And when it's mature, it will produce, those spores will fly out. We've got sort of a completion of the life cycle. So what we have, and in the supplement business, we identify what we call plant parts. Because when you're buying a supplement, for example, are you getting the leaf? Are you getting the fruit? Are you getting the flower? Are you getting the root? It's very important. Any herb, and you know that because you've worked with herbs out there, there's a specific part of that plant that's the important part that has most of the compounds that we're looking for. So with this organism, we have spore, we have mycelium, and we have mushroom. Those are the three plant parts. And the part that has been utilized traditionally as a medicinal or even as a sacred plant, so to speak, or a sacred mushroom, is the mushroom. The mushroom is what has been used in traditional Chinese medicine. Has been used for spirituality or healing. So that's really the key to understand there. And one of the differences between this fungal organism that produces a mushroom and then what we would call a mold. And most people are familiar with molds because if you're eating bread or some of your food, you'll see something growing on it. And it is basically what you're normally seeing is you're seeing mycelium growing. It'll start out primarily looking like a white, fuzzy, filamentation type growth, and then it will turn a color. So oftentimes when you see it on the bread, if it's a little bit mature, you'll see it'll be a black mold, a green mold. When it turns colors, those are spores that are making that color. And people molds have gotten sort of this reputation of, oh God, I've got mold in my house or something, and that's making me sick. And what it is that that mold will cause a respiratory disease, and it's the spores. So you don't want to be breathing in mold spores. Now, we're breathing them in all the time naturally, but not in a concentration that may happen inside your house in a room. You've got mold growing on your walls, and the mold, it'd just be a mycelium, but then it's sporulating. They even have a disease called mushroom worker's lung. And that comes from, if you're in a mushroom house and mushroom house is an enclosed space, and if you're harvesting mushrooms, you're in there 8 hours a day, day after day. And if those mushrooms are allowed to mature, that room will be filled with spores. And so these harvesters are breathing in these spores, and that gives people an allergic reaction. And that's the mold. And the mold does not produce what we would call a fruiting body. So the mycelium is a vegetative body, the mushroom is the fruiting body, and basically a mold, the difference really, one of the major differences, it does not produce a fruiting body. It's simply in the mycelium stage only. So it doesn't produce this mushroom-like structure. So the key thing to remember, and especially when you're buying a supplement, is are you getting mycelium or are you getting the actual mushroom? And the mushroom is what you're really looking for. So again, those are the three plant parts that you have. In China, it's really interesting, Jason, because they harvest spores from reishi mushrooms now. So in these greenhouses where they're growing hundreds upon hundreds, thousands of reishi mushrooms, they will shroud them. They will put a bag at the bottom of each one. And when they mature, they'll allow them to grow for an extra 30 days just to harvest the spores, which today are worth more in China than the actual mushroom itself. And one mushroom is producing billions of spores. I weighed up a bag of spores over there, and it was 400 grams from one mushroom. 400 grams. It was like a huge bag of spores. It was unbelievable. But the important thing here again is what is it that you're really looking for? And it's the mushroom. Just like if you're looking for a psilocybe mushroom, well, you want the mushroom, right? You're not looking for mycelium or spores or anything like that. You want the actual mushroom. That's the biofactory for these compounds, and that's what we're interested in when we are consuming, whether it be these plants or these mushrooms. And different species, for example, will produce different amounts of psilocybin and psilocin. So that's part of it as well, is that there'll be different species of psilocybe mushroom, and each one will have maybe a few minor differences. I mean, certainly in Mexico, the indigenous people there have different names for the different species, which is quite interesting. They have common names as well. I mean, they call them pajaritos or hombrecitos, mujercitos. So that's part of how they would recognize the different species, or just in general, because in general terms, I'd primarily call them pajaritos or hombrecitos or mujercitos.
So from the I guess you'd say the evolutionary point of view for the mycelium, one could think about the mushroom itself as kind of like the analogy used as the fruiting body of the tree. That's the mushroom itself is what produces the spores to allow the mycelium to propagate itself.
Sure. And you could also look at the mycelium and consider it to be similar to a root structure, because what it's doing, it is building nutrients into its body and then feeding those nutrients to the production of these mushrooms. And in a mushroom season too, what's really interesting is that mushrooms will come up at the same spot every year. But if they exhaust their food source, that mycelium that has produced those mushrooms, that vegetative body, will die. It's not like the mycelium is there forever. It's not. It's got to have the food to continue to grow and propagate. So even old mycelium can die off while new mycelium continues to grow out. And that mycelium, when it's underground, it will continue to spread and grow as long as it can find sufficient and proper food. And it's important to understand too that different species will grow on different what we call substrates. For example, Psilocybe cubensis grows on a cow patty. So cow pie, it's a dung inhabiting fungus, whereas others are wood inhabiting. A wood inhabitor is not going to grow in that cow pie, period. So each particular species has, as they've evolved, are specialized to break down certain types of organic matter. So you can't just think, oh yeah, this thing will grow in whatever, just plant it out there and away it goes. No, not at all. So just like the idea that, oh, this thing will live forever, it won't. In some cases, it will grow for example, psilocybes really kind of like to grow in disturbed areas. They have a mushroom in Mexico they call the derrumbe, which means landslide mushroom. You get a fresh landslide and up come specific species, but they may only be in that landslide for the first or second year. It's just like a morel mushroom. It's the same. They like burned off areas. They will come right into a burned off area. It's kind of the burn. They figure it's kind of sterilized this area. Now the morel, it fits what the morel needs to grow. It comes in. The first year, it's amazing. Second year, a little bit. Third year, nothing. So again, it's not like that mycelium is going to be there forever. However, if there is an area where it's getting a continual food source, like maybe it's a symbiotic mushroom that's got a relationship to a tree. And so it's hanging out there with this tree. There's a lot of new material that's coming down around the tree all the time. Plus it's hooked up with the roots of the tree. It's got this relationship that will probably be there for years and years and years and years, unless something happens to the tree. So it's a kind of a complex environment or relationship, but at the same time, yeah, it's not necessarily so. But I think the important thing to remember is that each species has an enzyme system that is specific to a certain type of organic matter. So if you've got a mushroom and you want to grow it and it is a wood decomposer, primarily you're going to grow it on something that is high in cellulose, something that is high in woody, or could even be straw or something like that. But it's not going to grow in dung or in soil or something like that.
So it seems like with the mycelium, with this limited lifespan, as you said, it can survive as long as it's getting food. So, for example, in dung, that would seem like a relatively shorter lifespan. If it's a decomposing log, maybe a little bit longer, but still relatively short. But in this example you used of maybe like a live tree that's constantly feeding it, is there any evidence of mycelial that had been around for hundreds of years or thousands of years? Is there any idea of like a potentiality of how long a mycelium could potentially stay alive for?
Well, that's really an interesting concept, isn't it? It's almost like a sacred tree. You know what I mean? It's like this tree in our environment, it is producing, let's just say, the mushroom sacrament. And we are, in a sense, we revere this tree, we protect it, because we know that it will produce this wonderful mushroom. And in a way, one of the mushrooms, I mean, psilocybes are not symbiotic in that sense, but something like Amanita muscaria is definitely associated with forests and trees. It doesn't grow out in the open areas or on wood or anything like that. Look, there are mycologists out there that study this type of thing, and I think we'll probably see more of that. And the other thing too is sometimes people have this, like a mushroom coming up on their property somewhere, and so I think as there's a greater awareness of mushrooms, we're going to probably see people coming out with that type of information, which may be out there already. And for example, I mean, look, in Europe, one of the major commercial mushroom species is the truffle, and the truffle grows with oak trees. So again, you can go out into these oak forests, and they go out year after year after year for hundreds of years, harvesting these truffles from the same forest. And what happens, however, is that, like with the truffle harvest, there was a point I think it was in 1850 or 1900, when the amount of truffles that they were harvesting was somewhere around 200 tons. Now, since then, all of a sudden now, in today's world, they only harvest 9 tons. Well, okay, what changed? One, all of those oak forests were cut down for, let's just say, commercial purposes or suburban purposes, housing projects. All of a sudden, that environment was changed to the point where the habitat was pretty much gone. So it shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. And not only did it shrink, but at a certain point, they realized what was going on, the truffle industry, and they did a lot of research, and they started utilizing the mycelium and putting it together with young oak seedlings, and then they started to put in oak plantations with the truffle mycelium on the roots already, and those started to produce over time, which allowed the industry to sort of stabilize. But you think about that for a minute, and you go 200 tons down to 9 tons. Pretty incredible. And that's sort of an issue with wildcrafting, and that's an issue with so many different species, whether it be plant or animal, that when you disturb or ruin its habitat, all of a sudden you're not going to be able to go out and harvest as much as you used to. And that's where wildcrafting, I'm not a big fan of wildcrafting because of that, because as a species, we tend to go out and harvest until there's nothing left, unless there's some very strict regulations put down and it's controlled in a certain way. Fisheries are a great example of that. You can ultimately control fishing on a river. You can say, okay, this is fly fishing only, or this is you have to throw the fish back. You can't keep it, or you're limited to only 1 fish a day. You can put in those kind of rules and regulations, and if you have the will to enforce it, you can maybe carry on with that particular resource. But just a sort of little side story. The interesting thing about Oaxaca, Mexico in the 60s was that because of that Life magazine article, many young people of my generation flooded into Oaxaca and flooded up into the mountains where to this small little village up there where Maria Sabina was. And they were all up there to get mushrooms. Some of them were up there to see if they couldn't have a session with her. And it got so bad. I mean, you can imagine. I mean, nobody's being very respectful. People are eating mushrooms. They're wandering through the mountains, literally wandering very high, enjoying themselves, generally speaking. But what about the locals? What are they thinking about this? People wandering around very high on mushrooms day and night, when these are used in healing ceremonies that take place during a velada late at night. So in 1968, they actually closed the whole area down. They brought in the army. They set up checkpoints on every road going into the area, and they then went into the area and they swept up every single gringo they could find and deported them. They closed it off, Jason, for the next maybe close to 20 years.
Wow.
You could not go in there as a foreigner unless you had some kind of special permission. Now, I went in there in 1972 secretly, and it was, it was a bit of I took a real chance to get up in there, but I had a friend that was up there and I wanted to go up and see him. And so, but it was, the interesting part about that too was like, okay, so now they closed it off, which was a good thing because it was really disrupting the whole, let's just say the communities up there, really disruptive. And you can imagine the other thing that's happening, and I'm sure it's happening down in South America as well, which is all of a sudden that sacred plant is now a commercial commodity. And now it is being bought and sold. And once something becomes a commodity and is bought and sold, you generate a lot of feelings that in many cases are not very positive. And so in that sense, it was a good move for the government to do. And I went up there again in 2002. And at that point in time, it had been lifted. It got lifted somewhere in the 80s, and they allowed people back up. But at that point in time, everybody had forgotten about it. They had literally forgotten about it. And so when we were up there in 2002, there were 3 Mexican hippies in town, no one else. They actually, at that point in time, were having a mushroom festival every rainy season.
Were you one of those 3, or three plus?
At that point in time, no. At that point in time, I was, like, okay, I had my business well established and things like that. But I was down in Mexico I went to a conference actually, I think at that point. And then we spent some time in Oaxaca, and we went up there, and we actually had my wife and I had a very nice, interesting balada with a local curandera there, who was a really wonderful woman, Doña Julia. And at that point in time, in the 90s, Maria Sabina had died and was long gone. And there was still a little bit of, let's just say, there were a few people around that would give you a balada. A lot of them were, in my opinion, they were the wrong kind of people to be doing it. But it was a kind of a money-making thing. And so some people got hoodwinked, so to speak, and with these people. But this woman was genuine, and she was actually a relative of my friend who was no longer alive at that point in time, but I had known about her from him. And so I went up there to see her, and we had a really wonderful experience with her. And, I think the other thing too to remember is that the use of the mushroom in Mexico was for healing purposes. So when they had a velada, it was, in a sense, doctor and patient. So it was the curandera and her patient. And the interesting part about it to me was that they both were consuming the mushrooms. So the patient was consuming the mushrooms. In a lot of places, it's not that way. The sick person is not going to be consuming the mushroom or whatever the plant happens to be. But in this case, it was. And the thing that she's really trying to do is she's trying to diagnose. And also, I think a lot of it too is, that experience is so powerful. I think if you can get somebody to into the proper space, they can come out of it with a whole different, not just mental vision, but physical. I mean, one of the things I think that people don't talk about much with these experiences is just the physical part of it. Because for me, one of the things about it, whether it was LSD or mushrooms or something, was you could get into an ecstatic state. And that ecstatic state, in my opinion, could be the ultimate healing state, to where every cell in your body is lit up and you're just in a state of ecstasy. And in a sense, at that point in time, you're letting go. For me, it's kind of like the Beatles song, "Turn off your mind, relax, and flow downstream," or float downstream. That to me is really a big part of it. And at the same time, because so much was written about these states historically by, let's just say, natural scientists in the early 1900s, and they all looked at it as a visionary state. And so, I mean, I was sort of looking for visions, but I think at the same time that gets overplayed, because really, if you can just let go and relax and let it just wash over you, and in this sense, that's kind of like becoming one with the universe in that sense. I think that state is probably one of the highest healing states that we can reach. And that's where, if you go really back in time to all of the sort of ancient writings about the experience and how they talk about it, I think that's primarily what they're really getting to is consume this plant, this sacrament, and reach, however you want to say it, reach the Godhead, reach the universal energy field that's out there. But that I think is really something. I don't know whether people talk about it this way anymore or not, because I've kind of not tuned in so much to what's going on, because there's conferences and there's all sorts of stuff going on out there, which I really have not taken part in. So I don't know. I only know this from my own experience. And man, let me tell you, when you're in that state, it is just like, wow.
This is great. I was actually going to get into the more nutritive and medicinal qualities of mushrooms first, but I think you've jumped right into the deep end. So why don't we go there? When you were speaking, I was actually reminded when you were talking about the cutting down of the oak trees. I was actually reminded of a story I heard. It was either from the Shuar or the Ashwar. They're a group of people in the Ecuadorian Amazon, and they have very very specific gender roles, and they say that the nature of men is to hunt and to cut down trees, because that's what they have to do to provide their food, to provide their wood to cook the food. And they would say the engendered role of the woman, because they see that the man, because his nature is to hunt and to cut down the wood, but that he lacks wisdom and he doesn't know when to stop. And that was kind of that story you were saying with the oak tree, and that the wisdom of the woman isn't in her nature to hunt and to cut down the wood, but her wisdom is to tell the men when to stop. In a way, she's the peacekeeper, she's the wisdom keeper who knows how to create that harmony or that balance in nature. And so it just reminded me of that. It also reminded me, or actually it made me think for the first time when you mentioned this idea kind of the sacred tree, that potentially one of the reasons people may have looked at that tree as sacred, and it's something really fascinating, because you see this in forests all over the world, but I know, because I've spent a bit of time in the Amazon, that I don't know the exact distance, but within a number of kilometers, there's often one tree that they would call like the mother tree. And it's often the biggest tree. It's the tree that they would say on a more spiritual level, it looks after the other trees. It's the guardian. And so if you're walking in the Amazon and you come across like the Lupuna tree, for example, which is often this massive tree, people would pay a lot of respect to it. They would ask for permission to pass. They would give it offerings. But it was this idea that there was something very sacred about it. And when you were speaking about that, I had never really made that correlation, that there could be something that, because that tree was so massive, that all around, I mean, I'm kind of imagining like radiating out from that mother tree would be like very concentrated soil, because it's the biggest landmass, or the biggest creator in that area. Is that something you've seen? Because even in a lot of European or American traditions, that you mentioned this idea of the oak and was it the morel or the chanterelle?
Well, with the oak trees, of course, it was the truffle.
The truffle, sorry.
Yeah.
So is there do you notice other correlations between specific trees that particular mushrooms like to grow around that tree? Because I'd never really thought about that before, but that's a very interesting concept, because again, the oak tree, for example, is considered a very sacred tree, not only for its own medicine, but I wonder if there is some sort of correlation between certain mushrooms that may have a propensity to grow near certain trees.
Well, there's certainly a lot written about sacred trees in the whole Near East and India and all of these traditions. That the sacred tree, or the cosmic axis too, they call it. I mean, it's in a lot of their mythology. It seems to be something that's very important, and there has been speculation, certainly, that one of the reasons for this is the fact that in that whole area, that part of the world, the Amanita mushroom grows in conjunction with specific types of trees. And it varies depending on where you happen to be, because it will grow on a number of different species, but primarily seems to grow with conifer type trees. So that association, certainly you could go, my God, this plant, it's growing with this particular tree. We want to protect that tree. We want to protect that forest, because that's where it comes on. The cosmic tree is also, and the axis is also something that in shamanism has been pretty well documented. And certainly, for example, the Siberian shamans that were using Amanita muscaria, and this is where a lot of the mythologies of the Christmas tree, for example, come from, and the idea that not only that in Siberia the shaman actually will come down into the structure on that cosmic tree that's in the center of this home. And also there's some ideas of them even drying these Amanita mushrooms on the trees themselves, kind of like if you think about ornaments on a Christmas tree. And so this association with the cosmic tree, I think it could very well be, or stem, let's say, from the association. And, I think that sacred plants, for example, I mean, there's a lot of mythology that gets built up around sacred plants and where they grow and how they grow and the meaning of that. And so those types of associations, I think, are relatively common, and you can imagine why they would be. I mean, we would consider that if we have certain species that are growing somewhere that we is producing some kind of fruit or that we really highly prize, and in this case it'd be something sacred, that would be very important for us to try and protect, and we could have mythologies and things like that of why we do that, because a lot of times the mythologies, they get misinterpreted over time, and so a lot of what we read about, it's like Greek gods or things like that. I mean, and they have all sorts of reasonings for who these gods are and why they're doing one thing or the other. But when you pull all that away and you look at it from, let's just say, a astronomy basis, well, they've kind of like proven now that it's all, a lot of that is based on astronomy and the planets and where they are and what that means for us as humans. I mean, it's just like, are you familiar at all with precession? Well, you think about precession, and for those who don't know what precession is it's essentially a 26,000 year calendar, so to speak. And we all think of astrology as some like woo-woo kind of stuff. Well, the fact of the matter is that initially our world and how it functioned was divided into 12, what some people call houses, or 12, in this case, it was 12 2,100 year parts, because that's the amount of time it took for the Earth to go through this, what they call the Great Year. And that's something that's kind of been totally forgotten by most people. I mean, it's kind of coming back a little bit now because archaeoastronomy or astrotheology has become more of a subject that people study. But it's so interesting when you start to take that into consideration of the fact that people actually figured this out tens of thousands of years ago. Well, and when you get right down to it and you think, well, how's that possible? Well, and then you think, well, what did we have to look at night? and that was the TV of the time, really, when you think about it, and people studying that and passing down that information, and ultimately, in some cases, putting it in stone. There's been a lot of, stone monuments out there where they look at those and they can see they have all these astronomical alignments. And in fact, I just read an article this morning where some researcher came out and again sort of confirmed that Stonehenge was a very, very large calendar set up according to the motion, celestial motion. And I think too, when you think about even consuming plants or mushrooms for their psychoactive qualities, you're doing it at night generally. And I've always wondered about timing. And, when I was in Mexico in the early 70s, the full moon was really a big deal for us then. We celebrated it. It's always been celebrated, but how many people in the city celebrate the full moon anymore? or even know when there is a full moon. We're so out of tune, out of touch with the whole, let's just call it celestial mechanics, which I find just it's fascinating when I start to think about that in any way. And so I'm very conscious of when the full moon is, or the new moon, when it's, you know, complete darkness, or the full moon out and you have this moonlight out there. I find that very important marking of this motion that's going on that we just kind of ignore these days and think, oh, whatever. And in those days, during the full moon, that was really a time when we would, you know, often be, okay, yeah, we're going to take this really great trip, have this experience on the full moon.
This is great, Jeff. I think we could go on for a couple hours about all this. This is this is stuff I love to talk about. Yeah, I think that's a fascinating thing. I think a lot of people probably aren't even familiar, like, with the precessional equinoxes, what that means. Even I think most people, they probably have some idea that the Earth rotates around the sun, or there's a symbiosis. The Earth and the sun are rotating together. That also the Earth is revolving around its own axis. But I think very few people realize that there's that third precessional rotation, and it's such a fascinating thing, because even as you were saying, in ancient times when we had better visual, just a better visual of the night sky, I often think, because when you break that, 25 some thousand year great year into 12 cycles, it's 2000 some years. If you break that, into 360 degrees, which is the actual change, that's 1 degree every 72 years, which 72, 7 plus 2, 9, very sacred number.
Yes, exactly.
But even to look at that, I mean, 72 is, most people would say that's a pretty healthy age. If you live to be 72, you had a pretty good life. But yeah, even if you started when you were 1 year old and you were looking at the sky, you would only notice a 1 degree difference by the time you had died. I think it really points to something which I'd love to talk to you about, which you alluded to a little bit, is that, one of the things that really drew me to this plant work was this idea that I really sensed in kind of my own journey, that you mentioned this idea that part of these mushrooms, or the plants, these healing plants, or these sacred plants, are pointing us to this idea of oneness, or God, or this gnosis, this experience of that. And it was something that you said a little bit about in the beginning, maybe similar to you, that it was something in the culture that you grew up in that you felt was lacking. Like, we had these kind of, I don't want to say empty rites, but that they had lost their meaning, as you said. They had become lost in the dogma, in the ritual, rather than the true essence. And I think that's probably a lot of what people in, like, my father's generation also were looking for. Was we realized something was missing, and so these plants or mushrooms, I think for a lot of people, and I think that's why there's another big resurgence of it today, is because they sense what they're looking for can potentially be accessed through these things. And I was really happy because I listened to another interview with you, and I think the mushroom is a really fascinating thing. And some people, when we say this, they may be familiar with it, but to a lot, it's going to be pretty shocking. But this idea that these plants or these mushrooms could have been at the basis of all religion. And I know that's a very bold statement. But again, all, as you were mentioning, like the Vedic calendars, the Mayan calendars, the Egyptian calendars, they all did use these precessional cycles. And before we started rolling, you were saying in 95 you came to Peru, and I was here in 94 as a kid, and I remember going to Sacsayhuaman and just seeing these massive stone structures, and then going to other places, and I was taught these were Incan structures, and I just accepted that. But then I remember seeing other structures that were also Incan structures. And even as a kid, I mean, I wasn't an architect or a mason. I didn't know stonework. but it was very clear to me that whoever built those massive stone structures were not the same people who built these stone structures that, as a kid, I could understand how those smaller stone structures were built. Like I may not have had the strength to do it, but I could understand mathematically, literally how people could do that. The massive megalithic stone structures, I can't. And I think anyone who may be, especially if we view time in this linear fashion, and that as we go back in history, people were more and more primitive. I think anyone would be lying to themselves if they say, well, with these primitive methods, you were able to build these things. We're not even sure that we could build them now, if we're truly being honest. But I know this kind of a long tangent, but going back to this idea of mushrooms as a sacrament, I guess this is maybe a two-part question. One of the questions I wanted to ask you was this idea, because a lot of people, when they hear of mushrooms, they hear of this idea that a mushroom isn't a plant and it's not an animal, that it's something in between. So maybe if you could talk about that, and also some of your early like velada experiences, because as you said, you have been kind of away from this, what's maybe being called like a renaissance of psychedelics, but with a lot of that, it's moving in a very particular direction. And I'd be really curious to hear in the 60s or 70s what your experience was, because I think that's something very valuable, and something that you mentioned, which was really important, was this idea that there was a healing that was happening, and that there was some relationship that was happening in that space between you, the mushroom, the curandera, and what that was like for you. And I think I was also reminded of that because you use this word like doctorcita, or doctorcito, mujercita, hombrecito, which is this idea that I think we may overlook, but it seems to be alluding to the fact that there is something that's just beyond this physical form of this mushroom, that it's almost being anthropomorphized, that some people may call it a spirit, but there's something beyond just the mushroom itself. And so I'm curious also in this realm of from a more like scientific point of view, what does that mean when something isn't a plant or an animal? So I know that's a long thing, but I guess maybe to start those two parts, like that difference between plant and animal, and then also some of your earlier experiences in Mexico. I'd be really curious about that.
Well, I'm when it is interesting, kind of a mushroom. What is with this organism? And there's a number of aspects to that are quite interesting. And if we go back into prehistory and we go back to the Middle East and the original, what you could call the original mushroom cults. One of the things that you have to realize about a mushroom too is that, look at this thing. Where does it come from? There's so many mythologies around that alone. It's like people go, it wasn't there yesterday, but there it is. Why and how and where did it come from? And where people maybe didn't really understand the whole idea of, oh, well, it's actually, the body of it is actually underground and it comes up. And maybe that's wrong. Maybe they did. I don't know, because when you think about it, you think of plant roots. If you do any sort of investigation, you'd probably figure that out. But here it is, up it comes. And the other part of that I think we have to understand is a mushroom is very, very phallic. And that is part of these original mushroom cults, especially in the Near East, were considered to be not just a, let's just say, experiential, visionary quest or anything, but it was also considered to be part of like Dionysian rites, where people were not just taking these as, oh, gee, I'm going to take these, lay down in a room, and here we go. No, it could be wild sort of dancing and just ecstatic motion, which a lot of which could be sexual, but the mushroom and its shape alone was one of the reasons why, my God, it has this shape very much like this appendage to a male body, which gave it even more significance in terms of being. And they described a lot of these early cults as sort of sexual. And look, what is religion really? I mean, we look at religion and we think about it as being an organized kind of people get together and they're in a structure and there's some priest. It's hierarchical, and when in fact maybe not. Maybe it is just this. The early, like for example, I think the whole idea that religion stemmed from these particular plants or mushrooms, I consider that to be just common sense. I mean, why else would people create this other? And early, I mean, why would Christianity adopt this? Eat the bread and drink the wine, the body of the Christ. Well, that makes perfect sense for me too, because you're communing with this other part of who we are. So to me, I just feel like all of those early religions started out in a much different and could very well have been communal rites, but it was something not like everybody sitting in a church pew, kneeling down occasionally or singing a hymn or anything like that. No, it was a much broader, probably orgiastic type of community. So to me, that's really at the root of most religions, and certainly over time you build up more mythologies around what's going on, and right down to where you're getting to the rites of Eleusis, where people go to Eleusis for this experience, and there's still some speculation of exactly what they were doing there, but certainly one of it was to have this very specific, special experience there, which was you could call it an initiation to some degree. But there's enough evidence of these plants, and especially mushrooms. I just think the mushroom is something that I mean, and this is where, to me, the difference between mushrooms and ayahuasca, without going into what are the actual feelings or visual or anything like that, is simply that the mushroom is actually kind of pretty simple. Here it is. It's a psilocybin mushroom. Eat it. There you go. It's not like marrying two plants together, cooking this brew, hoping it turns out to be the same as last time, or maybe not. So the mushroom, to me, plus its phallic shape, fits in so perfect to who we are, and it's so easy in that sense too. And you have to believe that people discovered it pretty early on, because they're out there foraging for all sorts of things, and they do learn about plants and mushrooms and which ones are good to eat, which ones you have to avoid, which ones stimulate you in this other manner. So in that sense, the history of it, I think, is clear. There's plenty that has been written about that. The Christ was just, in my opinion, the culmination of so many other Christ-like figures that came along through all of these other religions. And they all of these figures and all these had the same attributes. So that he came along, it's like, look, I don't believe in the historical Christ. No, and people interpret the Bible any way they want, but I look at it in a totally different manner as other people would. There's certainly enough information out there and enough iconography that of mushrooms in Christian churches and so on. I don't know if you're familiar with the book that Gordon Wasson wrote, Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality, and then John Allegro wrote his book about the Amanita mushroom, sacred mushroom and the cross. All of the information is there. It's just that the mainstream media does not want to. I mean, do you really want to push back on Christianity? Oh God, look out! Be careful. That's a subject that, boy, if you go out there, like if I were to go out there and say, well, you know what, Christ was actually a mushroom, people would want to have me committed, right? I mean, it's like, and I believe that. Just like Wasson demonstrated that, in fact, the Soma was a mushroom, and I believe that too. I'm think about this for a second. Why are cows sacred? Well, if a mushroom grows out of cow dung, why not? And Krishna, he's a blue god. He's shown with an umbrella that happens to look just like a mushroom. He's associated with cows. I mean, it's all right there if you want to look at it. Now, I'm gonna just make a quick move up to a different location where I can plug in, because my computer's saying, "Hey, you got a low battery." Sure. But and then sort of like moving this on to my own experiences and what we were doing in the 60s. Well, you know, part of that is, again, like I was saying, we did not have guides. We did not have shamans that we could work with or anything like that. We did not have Don Juan. A lot of what we did was at night, take whatever it was, listen to music, for example. God, I mean, you know what it's like listening to music when you're high on whatever it happens to be. So rather than having a shaman singing to us, maybe it was the Beatles. And there's a lot of really, when you hear these groups like the Beatles or someone, and you listen to their music and you listen to their lyrics when you're high, you get a lot of different ideas out of what they're actually saying. You know, like the whole thing of turn off your mind, relax, and flow downstream. So they were, in a sense, some of our shamans, so to speak. But you know, we also were just doing things that, well, a lot of times too, it was just, you know, it was dark at night. You just in a room or wherever you had, maybe you had certain kind of lights on, not like flashing strobe lights or anything, but just low light, maybe candles, and just kind of kicking back and maybe just going into a relaxed sort of visionary type of state, or at least a state where you're just letting it wash all over you. But you're normally doing it in a group with friends, not very often alone or anything like that. And then the other side of it was that a lot of times we could be out in a natural setting, out in some forest somewhere where we knew and were comfortable and felt safe, and we'd be out there actually taking this. I mean, it's kind of funny when you think about LSD and the whole the way we described it was, oh, let's drop acid. It's kind of a funny thing to think about in that sense, but this was something that we all felt, because getting back to the whole idea, I mean, this was a real spiritual change, and it was looking at religion as this is just empty ritual that has lost its soul, really, and people just going through this rote type of behavior when in fact we sort of found, I mean, a lot of the books written back in the early 1900s and stuff were talking about the religious experience. I kind of think that we need to divorce ourselves even from the word religion, because it has too much baggage attached to it. We should look at it in a totally different way. And I guess you could say spiritual, or give it some type of name. But again, I'm somebody who, I don't think there's anything wrong with using plants or mushrooms recreationally, as long as it's done with some kind of respect. I think you can do that. You can also go after a different kind of experience, which is deeper, more profound. I think that's really important. But I don't condemn people that use it that way. I mean, other than, the people that, oh, you're going to take a gram of mushrooms and you go drinking at night. That to me is kind of like, why would you do that? I mean, I get it. It kind of keeps you alert while you're drinking. It's kind of like, okay, you could just use some kind of speed or coffee or something like that and carry on your drinking. What's the point here? Okay, yeah, you're just getting high and whatever, but it's not a mushroom experience or anything like that. So I'm kind of like that. But otherwise, in terms of people having a good time, maybe they're out in nature somewhere and they're taking a lower dose and they're just kind of enjoying being in that ambiance, and they're not expecting a full-blown type of experience or something. But no, that again, we're leaderless. we can read books by Timothy Leary or Ram Dass or these types of people. We can get some kind of direction from that. And certainly I was reading all of that kind of literature, past and present, because it was, in a sense, at university, part of my study of trying to put it all together. Anthropology, mushrooms, how deep does it go? Very deep. But that's kind of how I looked at, what was going on then. And again, good trips, bad trips. It was like you ultimately learned, like Aldous Huxley, Heaven and Hell. You could go somewhere you had to face demons that you never expected to encounter. That was part of it. But, and that's where some people would have a experience where it was like, that's it. I can't do it again. I don't want to go there again. I'm afraid. And ultimately, what you did learn too, certainly what I learned was it was kind of like the whole thing of the thing you have to fear is fear itself, because once you get that fear, because we had what was called, back then people would have a death trip. And all that means is like physically you felt, oh my God, I don't know what's going on. I feel like I'm going to die. Well, no, you weren't going to die. Everything is going to be okay. But the experience was so powerful that you just were afraid. And that ultimately stopped a lot of people. And that was what I would consider a bad trip, but you did ultimately learn something from that. And that's where, you get into all of this thing of set and setting and that type of information, which you would have had if you had some guide, some direction, something that could help you to, have some type of structure. And I don't mean ultra structure, but I mean some type of structure. Like I would have loved to have been Native American church style, teepee, fire, people singing around this fire, somebody at the door, somebody tending the fire. I mean, those kind of structures, hey, that's great. That's wonderful. So in that sense, I mean, it was a real experimental time, Jason. I mean, we were on our own, really, truly on our own.
Yeah, you mentioned so much there. I mean, these books by John Allegro, and and like, for example, he was a scholar and a linguist, and I think a lot of people don't realize that, and he's been criticized too. And obviously, translation is such a difficult process, and things can be taken so many ways, but I think one of the common arguments for a lot of these guys who were quite revolutionary in a way was, well, that doesn't make sense because there's no other evidence of it. But as the world gets smaller in a way, and certainly there's a benefit to that, is we have these things, I imagine, much like you studied, these like interdisciplinary studies and comparative studies, and really being able to cross-reference things and then see, like you said, well, actually, there are other references to that. And in Hinduism, which predates Christianity, they speak about soma, that was their sacrament that allowed them to experience Christ, not in that word, but
yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
No.
And even like Zoroastrianism, maybe a lot of people aren't familiar with that, but the Persian religion, and they also had Hauma, which was fascinating because in Farsi you don't pronounce the S, you pronounce it like an H.
Isn't that interesting?
So they were saying the exact same thing, Hauma, and in all of these cultures, and I think that's why South America, as you said, or Mexico, have become these almost meccas, is because there are these people who've managed to keep those traditions alive. And it's not something that you just necessarily read in a book. It's something that's real. Like when they're talking about a doctorcito, it's not some imaginary concept they have. But also, again, it's like the foundation of even the civilizations we come from, like this idea of gnosis, this idea of knowing, and not knowing like someone told me, the Pope told me, but a true knowledge and experiential knowledge. And even something with Christianity that I find fascinating is, and probably a lot of people aren't familiar with that too, but as you said, there are these archetypes that you see in so many other traditions that were in that part of the world, things like Dionysus,
Yes.
These Egyptian traditions, which the Dionysian traditions came from those, even predating those. Pythagoras, who we all know,
Mithras.
Yeah, absolutely. And like these people who actually studied these things, and that's where they gain their gnosis from. Even things that we consider very ordinary now, like mathematics. Pythagoras was part of these rituals, these Eleusinian rites or Dionysian rites, and as you said, it was this chance to die so that you could truly be alive. Even as you mentioned, probably a lot of people aren't familiar. When you do look at a lot of like early Christian iconography, there are mushrooms in the background, and you can kind of try and come up with other explanations about that, but it's pretty wild when you see a picture of Jesus and there's mushrooms behind him. Why are they doing that?
Yes.
So when, and again, for a lot of people, this may be very new information. I mean, even I was just thinking now, in the Catholic Church, most Christians today, as you said, when they're taking the blood and body of Christ, they look at it as a metaphor. But the Catholics don't. And I think a lot of people forget that. They don't believe it's a metaphor. They believe that's literally the blood and the body of Christ. So if that's literally what you're ingesting, why would you be ingesting the blood and body of Christ to be able to experience Christ?
Yes.
So why, and I know this is a big question, and you alluded to it a little bit, but why do you think this was such a worldwide phenomena and something that's still managed through, and maybe this is something we can also get into, but through all of these different prohibitions, and often when we think of prohibition, it's something we're thinking of more in a more recent context. But as you said, the many of these churches also had their own prohibitions to prohibit this gnosis from being passed down. So why do you think this was such a worldwide phenomena? And not just a phenomena, but possibly the essence of not only religion but the human experience. Why were these plants or mushrooms such a fundamental part of the human experience? What do you think it was trying to get to? I mean, you mentioned this God experience, but why do you think that's important for a human being to go into that, or to have that type of gnosis? What do you have any sense of like what the end goal is for that? Because I think that's something a lot of people, even today, like they come down. You mentioned ayahuasca, and they want to work with ayahuasca because they want to be enlightened. That's like a very common new agey experience. But I don't think many people have also really thought, like, do I really want that? What is that? What am I really looking for? Because often that also seems to me a bit of, I think part of it is coming from a genuine place, that this I think place that both you and I and many people have had of longing for something. In many of these Amazonian traditions, they say we have this nostalgia. We're longing for home. We're trying to remember who we are. But why do you think that was such a vital and fundamental thing of these very disparate traditions all over the world? And yet, as you mentioned, they seem to be pointing to something very concrete and almost universal.
Well, it's something when you were just talking about that, it came to mind kind of something that I was talking about earlier, and that is, if you think about the whole human experience, and first of all, I think that back in prehistory, we're coming to realize that there was a much greater spread of knowledge worldwide, and we see that certainly in all of these different astronomical buildings and structures and all of this all over the world. Everybody was sort of tuned in to that. And I suspect a lot of them were tuned into these plants. And what is it about those plants? Well, I would say that as much as anything else, it makes you feel really good. And as a human, we are pleasure seekers. And when you are approaching or in to this ecstatic state, there is no real higher pleasure than that. And I mean, it is just like, it is orgasmic. And that too is where you could sort of put the two together in terms of sex and these experiences, similar in many ways in terms of ultimately what you're feeling. The difference being that when you're with one of those plants, you can get to a space where it goes on for quite a long time and you're just vibrating in this. So in a way, people who took a large enough amount, consumed a large enough amount of these, would reach a point where they're just like, I've got to lay down and let go and just feel this pulsing through me. And that, God, you could interpret that in so many ways, and different cultures interpreted it in different ways. And you could, in fact, build religions around it at some point, if that's what you want to do, if that's where you were going as an organized society. And they did ultimately build religions around these experiences. But I just think as humans, what are we really doing? We're seeking pleasure on every level, whether it's eating some wonderful tasting food or enjoying the look and the aroma of a flower. There's just so much beauty out there in the world. And one of the things that these plants or mushrooms would do too would open you up to even greater levels of beauty. I mean, when you think about the colors and how vibrant they become, and how the world around us just becomes a pulsating energy field. The other side of this, which I haven't really mentioned too, is the geometry that we can experience that seems to be like something that is there. We don't necessarily see it with our, our mental and visual and everything like that because of our societies, but it's there. You look at all of the, and this is one of the things where I know for a fact that everybody was tuned in, is if you look at native clothing worldwide, they all share this beautiful, colorful geometry and patterns. So I can see that, and I can, it's like, I look at some of the native costumes from Eastern Europe, and I go, wow, those patterns are just what they're using in Mexico. Those patterns are just what they're using in Southeast Asia. Those patterns are worldwide. And those geometric patterns, how do we come up with sacred geometry? How do we come up with the whole idea of geometric patterns? Well, it's pretty simple. We have this experience, and the geometry and the patterns manifest to us, and they're colorful, and they're in motion. So that to me is absolutely makes it clear that worldwide people were all tuned into this, and to go beyond that, I mean, and I can't even begin to fathom or describe how it might happen, but you think too, well, if everybody can get into certain states, are there areas where they could be communicating on a different level? I mean, I don't know, maybe they could, but the fact that they are aware and that this is part of their experience, to me, simply proves that at some point in the not too distant past, peoples worldwide were pretty tuned in to what's going on, not only cosmically, but in our natural world, and what part we are of that, which is we're connected to it all. Because part of it is just that feeling of connectivity. We're not separate. We're absolutely a part of it. And that's, I think, maybe one of the most powerful parts of that experience is just, in a way, it's empathetic in terms of, yes. And now I look at that plant in a different way. I look at that animal I look at the waterways. I look at the world in a different way. And if you can do that, you have much more respect. You have much more reverence for the natural world. And unfortunately, as humans, we're so caught up in our tools and how clever we are. Oh my God, we're so clever. Look, we're talking on this, computers, and someone halfway around the world. Aren't we clever? Yeah, you are. And you're spending how many hours with your little handheld device and just flipping and flipping and flipping and flipping. And it's just like, what world are you living in? Take a break. You know what I mean? I these days I look at the world and I just think, especially these younger people, and could be any age, people with this little device in their hands. It's always in their hand. What's going on? And they could be walking down the street. I'm constantly seeing people are walking down the streets, or somebody's driving a car. As soon as they stop to park, out that thing comes. And even before they get out, they'll be looking at this little device. It's just like the zombie apocalypse is upon us. It's insane. It is so far removed. And people talk about, you get these people talking about, oh, we're going to go to Mars. We're going to go out into, why? Why do we even talk about that? That is pure insanity. So really, to me, in a sense, Jason, we have to go back to the future.
Yeah, that was beautiful. We mentioned a little bit about these like megalithic structures, and it's something I find fascinating because even you mentioned these geometrical patterns. They're often represented in these megalithic structures the way they were built, very similar, in alignment to processional lines on the earth, in alignment to astrological zodiac signs. I mean, to a precision that's unfathomable.
Yes.
Um, Especially if we look at time in a linear fashion. um, Even something like the pyramids, which I think a lot of people probably don't realize is, I mean, they're still standing, the Great Pyramids at Giza. And at one time, it was thought that they were covered with these blinding white marble cover stones. They have a particular name. I
Yep.
can't think of
Yep.
it right now. And then there was this like golden pyramid on the top. But there was accounts of these, ancient Arab travelers who would say like these things shone so brightly that they were blinding from hundreds of kilometers away. Even being here in Peru, when one goes to some of these sites, I mean, the size of some of these stones is, again, it's almost unfathomable. So what do you have any sense of why those were being built? Do you think that was part of just this reverence of like, we can do this, and there is beauty to it? There's it's kind of mimicking almost like this internal alchemy or this internal advancement, kind of this esoteric principle of, as above, so below, or as within, without. Or do you have some sense that, some people think they were like timepieces that were left to show in a way that there were, like, we were here. There were people before you in a way. And even today, I was reminded, the Hoover Dam, which people may not be familiar with, but it's a dam in the US. It's a massive structure, but the guy who built it, I think it's like 3 kind of circles, or I can't remember the exact geometry of it, but it's aligned to a certain zodiac in the
I
sky.
didn't know that. Wow, that's
Yeah.
interesting.
And he
Yeah.
said, and that was built before I think a lot of people really started thinking about this, like the archaeoastronomical aspects of this. And he said, it's because in 100, 1,000, 10,000 years, when we may not be here, this is the language that I think people will be able to understand. That looking at this, if I write in English, this was built by such and such at such and such date. 10,000 years, the English very, very well probably pretty high likelihood it's not going to be around. But this language of mathematics, this language of astrology, will always be around, because it's even when we think in these time scales, like we were talking about, it's unfathomable. These times are so great. We think about these things like the earth is however many billion years old, or the universe is however many trillions of years old. Something, even you mentioned this idea of traveling to Mars. I always find it fascinating. Like the nearest galaxy is the Andromeda galaxy, from what I've been told, but that it's 10,000 light years away. I mean, that's unfathomable. I mean, traveling at the speed of light, which is already unfathomable, unless maybe you've taken a large dose of mushrooms. I mean, these times and these spaces are unfathomable. So there also seems to be something, like, at least to me, something similar in these megalithic structures that seems to be mimicking that in a way. But I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. I totally agree with what you're saying. In a sense, I mean, think about it in a way too, because a lot of these things were built where maybe languages were symbolic, like Egypt, or maybe in other places they didn't even have a lot of written languages. Well, how do you leave this knowledge and figure that it's something that's going to last for a long time. And why not put it into stone? Why not create a stone structure that has this knowledge built into it? And it's so interesting that we're just starting to learn how to decipher it today. And in the last, let's just say 50 years, people are finally going, oh, okay, there's something else here besides just a bunch of stones put together, and oh, we think it's a temple or something like that. I mean, and that's what everybody thought in the beginning with a lot of these things. Oh, it's a temple. Well, that's just this old school thinking about it's all got to be tied to religion somehow, right? And oh, it's a temple and they're worshiping their gods and all. No, not at all. It's actually a calendar, or it's some type of astronomical structure that is going to be there for hundreds, if not thousands of years, to let future generations know or have this knowledge there that, like you're saying, who's going to understand English at some point, or be able to decipher certain writing, and is that even something that is going to give you the story of these, or would it give you just the story of Christianity? And so you never really know. So to me, all of those structures are put there for okay, we can pass on this information. We're doing it in a vocal way. We're passing it down in our songs and all of this pre-writing, but now actually we're going to put it in stone, and that way we can preserve this knowledge, because they must have understood at some point too that things can get destroyed as well and get lost, and you know, there's a lot of different theories on that too, in terms of whether it be lost civilizations or lost knowledge, and the whole idea that the Earth could get hit by an asteroid like in 11,000 BC and create havoc worldwide and wipe out cultures and so on. I mean, it clearly can happen. So the idea that you could put this stone structure in place, to me, just makes perfect sense. And something in their time. Now, how they did it isn't just another thing entirely. I mean, there are stones in Lebanon that are so massive, you know, rectangular stones that have been crafted some way that are so absolutely massive. You just are shaking your head to even consider how they were actually created, as well as just the structures around where they're moving so many of these stones, whether it is in Peru or whether it is in a lot of the temples in Egypt, or the Stonehenges, or, you know, these structures we're still kind of trying to figure that out. But yeah, that's kind of how I look at it. And I think that you just have to, you know, figure that, sure, they're putting their knowledge, rather than writing it out in a book with mathematical formulas. No, they're actually putting it in stone. Stone lasts. Stone has you know, pretty much shown us that it will last a long time. And even, you know, I mean, stone structures are different sort, even though they do degrade, and sometimes through different, you know, whether it be invasions or natural disasters or things like that. But a lot of them are still around. We're still looking at them today, which is wonderful, you know.
Yeah.
And by the way, just let me just say one thing here about the whole, for example, the John Allegro and Gordon Wasson. John Allegro, you know, this is one of the things that really has always disturbed me tremendously, because at that point in time, Gordon Wasson had just come out with his Soma book. And he was saying, oh, gee, one of the world's great religions was based on this plant, this mushroom. And it's like, that is pretty amazing claim in and of itself, right? That Hinduism is based around this, and the Rig Veda and the hymns to Soma and so on. And at the exact same time, here is one of the world's premier philologists who is on a team of investigators to look at the just discovered Dead Sea Scrolls. And who are these other people that are working with him? Mostly from the Catholic Church. He's the one guy on this whole team that knows the languages better than all of them. He's the true academic. He's like a wonderkind in his whole field of study. Gordon Wasson was working with people, linguists as well, because he was not a philologist. He was not an academic in that sense at all. He was working with people in universities to help him understand and translate a lot of things. John Allegro could do it himself. And what does he do? He comes out and says, well, I've looked at these Dead Sea Scrolls. It turns out that Christianity was actually based around a mushroom, and it was also a sex cult. And they have all of these really interesting ways that they were relating this in a code, which of course they're going to be putting it in some kind of a language like that and have a lot of different metaphors and allusions and so on. So for me, I considered him to be a much higher authority in all of this than a Wasson or certainly these people from the Catholic Church. He comes out and he has done his portion of it before any of them. And he actually is like, come on, let's put this out. And they're going, no, we want to wait, because they want to translate it according to their own needs, which is to support the church. He comes out with a completely different take on it, and he becomes an absolute outcast because of it. Why would he ruin his career over that? Well, he was an honest man. He wanted to just, this is what I found. Here it is. Boy, blasphemy. Not only that, he did it simply as an academic. He did not have any real ties to the mushroom. He was not somebody who was eating mushrooms and totally into this. No, he's an academic. Gordon Wasson has a lot of ties to, he's taken the mushrooms. He's really caught up in that. Allegro comes up, he's just an academic. They did not like Allegro because of that. And because of that, they poisoned the atmosphere around him and his book. I took his book at face value for what he had to say. Nobody could truly criticize it because nobody had the depth of knowledge as a philologist, as somebody who could translate the language that he did. So hard to actually criticize on its merits, but instead they could write him off as a blasphemer or as somebody, a crazy guy. Crazy. Hey, listen, Gordon Wasson just came out and said Soma was a mushroom, and here's another an academic, a true academic, saying Christianity was based around a mushroom. Hey, look, at the same time, two of our major religions are based on a mushroom. Isn't that interesting? Why would Wasson and his side of things not go, oh, see, that just kind of proves what we're saying? Instead, they came out and were just slamming him left, right, and center. And so many people picked up on that. And it was kind of one of those situations where, oh, you're afraid to say anything positive about it because the conventional wisdom by the people in this group are like, no, it couldn't possibly be. Well, yeah, guess what? They're protecting Christianity. Wasson's also a Christian. He didn't want to go into that territory either. So to me, I just found what Allegro had done to essentially support what I believed all along, was that these ancient religions, most of them were based around a mushroom, in some cases other plants, but the mushroom, let's just say, theory made perfect sense to me as like, well, sure, why not? And look at all the images of mushrooms we have everywhere. So anyway, I just wanted to say that because it disturbs me to this day that people have not truly accepted his work. I think they have more than they were before because of certain other people that got into it and published. I don't know if you're familiar at all with Jan Irvin, and it was they had a really great series on DVD and called I think it was Archaeastronomy and Shamanism or something like this. It was a good work where they explained a lot of the ancient symbols that are out there.
Yeah. There was another good book I remember. I think it was called The Jesus Mysteries. Very similar, going into the history of early Christianity, and again, I think these are just things a lot of people don't question, that there was no symbolism of Jesus for decades, if not 100 years after his purported birth. And
well, and there's no actual evidence of him being even a person. And when you look at him in terms of who he is compared to all of the similar, let's just call them godheads that came before him, he's just the latest version of all of them. And yet people just, or the church just needs to carry on with this mythology of him as a real person. And they go to great lengths to try and prove it somehow. I'm sorry, it just doesn't work.
The first account was Saul or Paul, and he never described Jesus. He described Christ. He was overcome by this light consciousness that was Christ, which is God. There was never a man there. It was he had to prostrate before it because it was so powerful. Yeah. And I absolutely agree. I mean, I don't think we have to look too far. I mean, the church or the establishment defaming someone, burning the book or buying up all the books, labeling them as crazy. I mean,
it's going many on parallels today.
But yeah, it's very fascinating. I mean, I feel like we could probably talk for hours about this. So
no question about it.
Maybe we'll have to do a part 2 just on this, because I think there's so much there, and but I think it's really vital. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with, I think his name is Brian Murarescu. He just wrote a book.
He was the one that was trying to prove that the sacrament at Eleusis was actually ergot. I think that whole idea and theory is just absolutely wrong. And
I don't know if it was ergot, because he was also looking at the origins of Christianity. I'm trying to think of the name of his book. It's slipping my mind.
I know the book you're talking about.
Yeah. But essentially saying that there was some sacrament, that it was probably a drink, again, there's different theories of that. But I was reminded even this idea that, because we were talking about this idea of like the blood of Christ, which is often translated as wine. But that's literally a mistranslation. Again, if you look at the linguistics of it, it's in Greek, it's pharmakon, which is where we get the word pharmaceutical, pharmacy from. It's, literally by drinking the blood of Christ, you're drinking a pharma, you're taking a drug, you're taking some substance that's putting you in touch with Christ. And, I think there's all of these clues, and it's, it takes a bit of, I think, in a way, a shift of consciousness to be able to be open to all of those, because we are, as you said, we do have these blinders, whether we want to admit it or not. It's just, and it's not even inherently a bad thing. It's just part of who we are, the societies we've been brought up in, the worldviews, everything we hear. And it does seem like these tools, these mushrooms or plants are very amazing sacraments in that way, to shake us up in that way. Like we often need to be shaken out of in Vedic philosophy, they would call it the veil, or in Christianity, that's what apocalypse means. It literally means the lifting of the veil. And we've been indoctrinated that it's the end of the world, as if it's the end of the physical world, rather than the end of the false world that we've created. And to lift the veil is to see the world as it actually is, to experience Christ. That's the second coming of Christ, is the apocalypse.
Yes.
And it's not something to be afraid of. It's our own nature. It's who we are. It's what we're all looking for. And again, that's where, translation can be so tricky. And
It can.
Yeah.
Well, in Hindu religion, it's Maya, right? And Maya is the general waking state that we're in, and that's considered an illusion.
Yeah. So I think we're almost at 2 hours, so I don't want to take up too much of your time, but maybe, let's see, but I would love to have you back sometime, because I think there's another 2 or 3 hours at least we could go into of all of this stuff. But I'd like to come back to mushrooms, because obviously we've been speaking more about the sacramental use. And as I mentioned earlier, when I was a kid, I remember being taught that there was no nutritive value to these mushrooms. It was just something people ate. And again, I remember thinking that was crazy. I mean, a big part of my family came from Eastern Europe. And that's a big tradition there, is people go out looking for mushrooms. And I like to think about that in the same way as any tradition. Like when you think about these megalithic structures, people just don't build those for no reasons. Nobody does something for no reason. Nobody goes out and takes the time and the effort to gather these mushrooms if they have no nutritional value. Like, these people knew that not only they had a tremendous amount of nutrition, but also these very particular medicinal values, which it seems like we're just now beginning to, maybe not just now, it's coming to light, but it seems like there's a lot more awareness of that there's, quote unquote, scientific research going into that. So that also is one of your areas of mushrooms. So I know that's kind of a big topic, but what would you say? How would you look at mushrooms in terms of their nutrition, in terms of their medicinal values? Because I think that's something people are coming to terms with. I think more and more people have maybe heard of reishi or chaga or lion's mane, and that maybe this one is good for this, or I'm losing my memory, so I'm going to take lion's mane, or I'm getting sick, so I'm going to take reishi. But what is going on with those mushrooms? Even like in China, there's, as you mentioned earlier, that there's a huge history of medicinal mushroom use. That even these ancient Taoist and Confucian scholars talking about these plants or these mushrooms of immortality, that they give us these long, healthy, robust lives, that maybe there's only 5 plants you need to take, and that will give you your health and well-being. So what did those Chinese ancients know, and that these mushrooms had this very potent medicinal value to them?
Well, I like to think about mushrooms. I call them the forgotten food, and I call them the missing dietary link. And that's primarily to us in North America. I mean, the Europeans eat a lot of mushrooms, and certainly in Asia, they eat a lot of mushrooms. And when I first went to work on the mushroom farm in 1973, classical nutritionists in the US basically said, hey, they have no food value. Well, the reason they said that, actually, what's kind of interesting, is that they're very low in calories. If a food has no calories, they just think, nah, what's the point, right? Well, the fact is, mushrooms, and again, every mushroom is going to have a different nutritional profile. So that's the other thing you always have to remember. It's not like, okay, all apple varieties which are pretty similar in their nutritional profile. But no, every mushroom has a different nutritional profile. 20 to 40% protein, pretty high quality protein. It's got most, all with the exception of one or two of the essential amino acids. They are low in fat. They're mostly carbohydrate, but these are carbohydrates that are positive carbohydrates. They're slow acting. One of them is called mannitol, very slow acting, slow to digest carbohydrate. Another one called trehalose. Mushrooms do not contain starch. Starch is, what we get from all those grains and stuff, and you eat refined starches and boom, up you go with the glucose and then down the other side. So mushrooms, because of these carbohydrates, and one of the primary ones too is what's called a beta glucan, which makes up 50% of the cell wall of a mushroom. So mushrooms are very slow to digest, and they are very high in fiber. So they will be feeding our microbiome as well. So they're, in that sense, a prebiotic, a high in potassium, phosphorus, B vitamins, B1, 2, and 3. They have up to 25% of some of those specific B vitamins. So they're really a very good food, very tasty. Go with just about anything. You can cook them in so many different ways. One of the things that is key to a mushroom too is cook it properly. Have you ever heard a young 5-year-old or 6-year-old go, "Oh, mushrooms, God, they're slimy. I hate those things." Well, you have them cooked properly. You cook them on a high heat and whatever your oil happens to be. I like to brown them up. I can eat a lot of mushrooms at a sitting, just as a main or one course of the dinner I'm eating or something like that. I can eat 100 to 200 grams of fresh mushrooms easily. But you can put them in almost anything, stir fries, eggs. There's nowhere you can't utilize them. They're just a really great food. And they've known that for a long time in Asia and Europe. A lot of studies that have been done show that populations that eat mushrooms, the people that do, they live longer than people that don't. Part of that is due to these beta glucans. The beta glucans in mushrooms are what give them their immunological activity. And the way I describe that is as potentiating the immune system. So we actually have receptor sites for beta glucans. They get down there, they link up with these receptor sites. They can stimulate the production of immune cells when we need them. Otherwise, the mushrooms sit in the background. Eating mushrooms or even supplementing with mushrooms is kind of like, think about it as preventive medicine. And, to me, diet is preventive medicine. We want our food to be our medicine. We want, diet is the foundation of our health, period. You've got to have a good diet to be healthy. So putting mushrooms into that diet is just an important addition. And don't think about mushrooms as, especially supplement wise, I'm going to take this today, my cold is gone tomorrow. Not how they work. It's kind of like, think of them as you would think of a vitamin. When you take a vitamin, whether it's C or D or something like that, you don't go, "God, I took this vitamin D yesterday and I feel so wonderful today. It's just fantastic. I really recommend it." No, think about it as something that is there in the background. Over a period of time, you should, feel like, oh, maybe I'm not getting as many colds or flus or something like this, because it does have antiviral activity. But again, if you've got a bad lifestyle, you don't get enough exercise, you're living in a city, you're breathing bad air and all the rest, well, it's not going to help you too much. But regardless, I'm always recommending to people that they put mushrooms into their diet. And then if they want to take a step further, like a little higher level of immunological potentiation, go ahead and supplement with a mushroom supplement. One I would recommend to a lot of people would be reishi. Reishi's a mushroom that's been revered in China for thousands of years. You see it in their art, their architecture. It's a wonderful mushroom. It's got one of the highest levels of beta glucans of all the different medicinal mushrooms, and it also has compounds called triterpenoids, which are very good for the liver. So it is kind of like a mushroom that it has the beta glucans, which most of the other medicinal ones have. All mushrooms do, but the medicinal ones have a beta glucan that's got a specific architecture to give you that immunological potentiation. But reishi also has the triterpenoids, which most of these other medicinal mushrooms do not have. So it's kind of an exceptional mushroom that way. So that's the first one I recommend if you want to supplement with one particular mushroom. Reishi would be the one. So again, they are just a wonderful food that is missing in the North American diet. We've got now 6 to 8 different species in our markets, which is fantastic. It wasn't like when I was a mushroom grower in the 70s. I mean, the agaricus was the only mushroom in the markets at that point in time. So that's all today, 6 to 8 species. It's amazing. I mean, we've got these wonderful. Have you ever had fresh shiitake?
Yeah.
God, it's just a wonderful mushroom. The flavor, the odor. I mean, shiitake it's my favorite edible mushroom. There's others. I mean, I like most of them, but I mean, enoki take. You ever had enoki take? This package of, like you look at it and like there's 1,000 mushrooms in there with these really slender stems and tiny little cap, and they're all bundled together, and they are so delicious. You strip them all away and you fry them up, and they're crunchy and got a nice flavor. I mean, it's just a whole nother area of food that a lot of people are missing, and there's no reason anymore not to be able. I mean, they're a little more expensive than some of the other vegetables, but and I say vegetable, they're not a vegetable, but they're in the vegetable section. So yeah, I really advocate for people to eat mushrooms, put them into your diet. They're a great food. They're a healthy food. And again, this gets back to really food as medicine and preventive medicine, because I think, we have to do things that keep us healthy. We have to stay away from things that are degrading our health. And that's where diet is just so important. And that's where putting mushrooms into your diet can really help eliminate all that other stuff that's not doing you any good, like processed foods. Oh, God. I mean, I suppose where you are in Peru, you don't have to worry as much about processed foods everywhere. But I mean, eating like here in Hobart, they've got a Saturday market, just farmers market with all sorts of great food. God, it's so wonderful to be in that. And when you find just an established market too that brings in organic produce and just does a good job of all of that, it's just a wonderful thing, because eating good food is it's something that's very pleasurable.
Yeah.
And healthful.
So adding mushrooms to the diet, if people are interested in supplementing with mushrooms, because that seems like a really popular thing now, whether it's in tinctures or powdered forms, it seems like that there's a number of mushrooms that have become quite popular. As you mentioned, reishi, chaga, lion's mane, turkey tail. Do you have any recommendation of what people should look out for? Are there like certain health conditions that one mushroom may be better? Are there ways of sourcing those mushrooms that are more beneficial? Because I would imagine, like any market now, there must be a lot of adultering and who knows exactly what you're getting. As you mentioned before, like where are those mushrooms coming from? How are they being collected or grown? There must be a lot of factors in that as well.
Well, there are. And you know what? One of the things that's happening in the supplement world, which is really unfortunate, is that mushrooms are really expensive to grow. So it's you really can't grow mushrooms in North America and then turn them into a supplement. For example, you go to the market, you buy shiitake mushrooms, maybe it's going to cost you $10 a pound or something like that. Well, maybe the grower is getting $5 a pound. Well, mushrooms are 90% water. Supplements are dried powders. That $5 that he gets for that pound of shiitake, now he has to get $50 for that same pound of shiitake. The economics does not work for mushrooms grown in the United States and put into the supplement market. It just doesn't work. That's why we grow all of our mushrooms in China and have been doing that since the 90s, because as a commercial mushroom grower, I knew the economics of it. China's where all of the recent mushroom science and any kind of really, even growing, China grows 85% of the world's mushrooms right now. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because what has happened is that companies in the United States now grow mycelium. And if you were to grow mycelium and it's pure 100% mycelium, it'd be like, okay, that's good. That works. It has beta glucans. It doesn't have the same level of compounds that you would find in an actual mushroom, which is why when you're out there looking for a psilocybin mushroom, you're looking for a mushroom. You're not looking for mycelium. You're looking for an actual mushroom. So what companies are doing is they're growing the mycelium on sterilized grain. And at the end of a grow out period where the mycelium grows and covers this grain, and that's 30 to 45 days, they'll take that, they'll take it out of their container, they'll dry it, they'll grind it to a powder, grain and all, and sell it and call it a mushroom. How is that possible? Well, you can do a lot of things in business that is not ethical, and I can just consider it totally adulterated. We do tests. My company does all sorts of actual testing for the active compounds. We test for beta glucans, we test for starches, we test for ergosterol, which is the fungal sterol, and another compound called ergothioneine. I did a study 6 years ago where I bought 40 of these products off the internet. I tested them all along with dried mushrooms and mushroom extracts. These products, a normal mushroom product would have 25 to 60% beta glucan, next to no alpha glucan, which is the starches, because mushrooms do not have starch. These particular products, now remember, they're mostly grain, because they've grown this mycelium on the grain, but it's mostly the grain. They're not separating it. Those products were, instead of being 25 to 60% beta glucan, they were on average 6% beta glucan. The alpha glucan, which are the starches, instead of being like with a mushroom, no starch, so it has a little bit of glycogen, which shows up as, a couple percentage. These were 30 to 60% alpha glucan, which is starch. So essentially what all that is demonstrating is that those products are mostly grain starch. They're selling those products, Jason, as mushroom. So you can go out into the marketplace and you can see these, what are being sold and labeled as mushrooms when they're not. They're grain starch. So people are unaware of that. Now, some of those products might be labeled properly if you turn them over to the facts panel and it says mycelium, and in the fine print it would say myceliated rice or myceliated oats. So they some of the companies, but many of the companies that purchase those products as raw materials, they have no idea because it's being sold to them as mushroom. So they put it out and they claim it's mushroom and it's got all the benefits of mushrooms. They're not mushrooms. They're grain starch with a bit of mycelium in it. And that's those products are 50% of the market, if you can believe it. 50% of what you would find in a store or the marketplace are those products. One of the top brands out there in the marketplace is that product. And it's really unfortunate because people who think they're getting a actual mushroom product are not. They're getting grain starch. And it's funny because a lot of people don't eat grains. Other people don't want starches, these sugars, grain sugars. They don't want anything to do with them. And yet they have no idea that that's what they're getting. They think they're getting a mushroom product. Sometimes people have cancer or these types of serious illnesses, and they want to get a mushroom product to help with their immune system while it's being torn down by chemotherapy or something. They're buying a bunch of starch thinking they're getting a mushroom. So this is a huge issue, and I've published a study about that in 2015. A lot of people now are very aware of it. So you'll see products now saying no grain, no starch, and that is something, no mycelium. That is something that has moved out. It has resonated in the marketplace, but still there's companies selling these and people buying them. And it's really unfortunate. So you have to be very careful. If it says that your so-called mushroom product is made in the USA, it's actually grain starch that you're buying.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that.
Oh man, it's horrible.
Yeah. You mentioned reishi. Are there other ones that come to your mind that you would recommend as general supplements to people?
Oh, sure. I mean, in a way, all of the mushrooms, what we would call the medicinal mushrooms, would have this immunological activity. For example, like shiitake or maitake, that's what we would expect as the major benefits from those. But others, like, for example, lion's mane has these compounds in it that stimulate what's called nerve growth factor. And we produce nerve growth factor, and it helps to organize and helps the production of neurons. As we age, we produce less of this. So they've done studies in Japan, pretty good studies actually, some clinical trials where they've demonstrated that lion's mane mushroom will stimulate the production of this nerve growth factor, and they've shown in certain types of tests. Now, again, this is all small scale clinical trials, but they have demonstrated that does help with memory after they've done tests on control groups and the people taking the mushroom supplement. So, and that's why people buy lion's mane right now is our number one seller. Because it's what people call a nootropic. Are you familiar with the term nootropic?
Mm-hmm.
That's the category. And, it's kind of like there's this whole idea of biohacking and anything that can sort of help to cope or manage or stimulate your organism in some way to make you more, like a lot of times more productive in some way, or more focused, or maybe your memory's a little bit better. So that is where lion's mane fits into that. And the whole nootropic category, it's just such an interesting thing where, just like the whole biohacking idea is interesting. I mean, and I don't know whether I totally subscribe to this idea of biohacking, but it's also just kind of a term that's like, okay, if you consume certain plants or other substances that will, in a way, stimulate or potentiate you to reach a higher level of whatever it happens to be activity. So, that's kind of, but biohacking too, they use all sorts of synthetics and things like that, which I don't necessarily agree with. So that's where lion's mane fits into that and has made it so popular. Cordyceps it's a real interesting mushroom that's not really a normal fleshy fungus is what we would call a normal mushroom, especially one that you eat. This is a small blade-like fungus that grows off of insects. Highly revered in China, grows on a caterpillar. They actually call it a caterpillar fungus, but that's wildcrafted, very expensive in China. We can grow a similar species that has been used interchangeably, and it's quite affordable. And so we grow the cordyceps, and it's been used for general weakness. So if you're having trouble, you're in an illness, you're having trouble getting over the last hump on that illness or something, that's where they would prescribe cordyceps. So useful for fatigue, lack of energy. Well, of course, who's going to pick up that and start to sell it? Well, anybody who's in the energy drink or performance area. So that's where cordyceps has kind of been slotted in. But again, it's been used for thousands of years in traditional Chinese medicine, and again, kind of for general fatigue. So cordyceps, that's where its use is probably best utilized. There's chaga. And one of the things I always tell people is like, look, if you go out on the internet and read about chaga, just forget about 90% of about what you're reading, because it's all just marketing speak. You know how some things end up being like a panacea. There's nothing it can't cure. It's the king of mushrooms. All of a sudden, it's like, no, it's not. But marketing wise, they love to promote it that way. And oh, is there anything chaga can't do? God, it drives me nuts when I see that, because I'm like, God, panaceas. I mean, please help me out here. So chaga has been traditionally used for people with stomach issues, alimentary canal issues. That's a common use of chaga. They brew it in. You can brew it into a tea. Have you ever seen a chaga, actually?
I don't know that I have. I've seen reishi, but I've seen turkey tail. I think I've seen lion's mane. I don't know that I've actually seen chaga.
Chaga is like, it's not a mushroom. It's not mycelium. It's this gnarly black growth that comes off the side of a tree. The tree has been infected with a fungal mycelium, and it's trying to fight off the infection, and it produces what is considered a canker. So they have a disease category called canker diseases of trees. That's what a chaga is. And look, it gets called a mushroom because, it kind of like fits into the category, but it's not a mushroom. It's not even mycelium. It's just this gnarly, irregular, dark growth. And you can brew it into a tea or supplement it. And I always recommend it to people who have stomach issues or any kind of issues that way. If you have irritable bowel syndrome or Crohn's disease, that's probably a good place for trying chaga to see if it helps at all. It's not the king of mushrooms, sorry. The other one that's one of our top ones would be, let's see, we talked about reishi, we talked about lion's mane, cordyceps, chaga. Well, those are the top four. And then, of course, turkey tail is another one that's becoming quite popular. And that's something that really is great immunologically. So that's where if somebody really feels like they're just not coping with all of the different, diseases that come along. The turkey tail is definitely one, and it's shown great immunological potentiation. So that's where it kind of fits in. And there's also, you could put maybe 3 or 4 of them together and take a combo product if you wanted to. We have one combo product we sell, which is 5 of the different mushrooms. We sell mostly powders, mushroom extract powders. Namex sells raw materials to other companies. Then we have a retail line called Real Mushrooms where people can get them, and it's a retail product. But at any rate, 5 together. There's, have you ever seen the products out there too that are like, you're looking at the label and, God, is there anything they didn't put into this product? It's like the companies that think the more we can put in, the better. And it's like, no, all you're doing is just like dumbing down all the good stuff. And that's the same with people that put out these mushroom combo products. I mean, the first one that came out was about 10 years ago. It was 10 different, and these were what I call myceliated grain products. And then the next thing I know, somebody came out with like 16. And then someone else came out with 24 species. I'm just like, good God, all you're doing is lessening the amount of the really good ones and putting in all these marginal ones. And somehow that's supposed to be better. It's this whole marketing arena where the marketing people just think, oh God, the more the better. And it's like, no, it just doesn't work that way. I mean, don't go beyond 5. And so, I mean, I take one of our products, and it's something that I designed a couple of years ago when COVID hit, which was, it's got mushroom extract, it's got 2,000 IUs of vitamin D, and it's got 30 milligrams of zinc. I used to take zinc and vitamin D all the time years ago, and then I kind of I'm not a great supplement taker, actually. I would put reishi in my coffee in the morning, which is kind of great for me. But then I thought, well, I should get back into taking zinc again, and I should be taking vitamin D again. And I thought, well, why not put it all together in a mushroom product? So I did, and that's what I take every day, as well as extra vitamin D and vitamin C, and that's kind of my supplement regime. I truly believe that if you're eating properly, you're going to get most of what you need. If there's specific areas where you think a supplement might help, do it. Like for example, vitamin D, absolutely. God, I mean, you've probably read about how so many people that have issues with COVID, they get COVID, and 50% of the people that end up in hospital have really low levels of vitamin D. And it's just like, God, supplement. Why haven't they been handing that out on the street corner to people? You know what I mean? It's just like, why are we not talking prevention here? Why are we waiting till people have to be hospitalized? I mean, why aren't we out there saying, hey, look, and the other thing is overweight people are the people that are going into the hospital. Why aren't we saying, okay, time to get serious about diet here. You need to stay out of those processed food aisles. Well, really? That's what American business is built on.
Yeah, I think you probably just got our video taken down from YouTube with that. Yeah, it's very strange times in that regard. I mean, very much like we were talking about the thing with the church and the demonization of John Allegro's work, and it is. I mean, there's a lot of ways you can take it, but certainly there are forces out there that are malevolent, and I think some is probably just negligence and not wanting to look into deeper things, but yeah, that's a real thing. It's and again, that's probably something a lot of people don't know about, is that I think obesity, I don't remember the exact number, but it's like 8 increases your chance of death 8-fold with COVID. Yeah, vitamin D, it was a huge it was a majority. I mean, it was well over 50%. I think it was close to 60-70% of the people who were very sick were severely vitamin D deficient. And
yeah, and what's interesting about mushrooms is, I was telling you, we test for a compound called ergosterol. It's the fungal sterol. You can expose that to UV light, and that UV turns that ergosterol into vitamin D2. And we get our vitamin D from exposure of our skin to UV radiation. And that turns cholesterol, our sterol, into vitamin D3. So, you know, we are actually producing now vitamin D from mushrooms. So it's coming from an absolute natural source. And if you look at how vitamin D3 is mostly made, it is a terrible chemical process where they're using a lot of heavy chemicals to ultimately, I mean, it comes from a natural source. It all comes from lanolin of sheep's wool. That's primarily where vitamin D3 comes from. And then you have to get it out of the wool first, and then you have to process that lanolin and extract and turn it into the vitamin D3. And it's quite a process. With this, you just take regular mushroom powder, put it under a lamp, and that will turn the ergosterol into vitamin D2. And so we are creating that now. And that was, you know, when I said this product that I'm taking that we created has vitamin D in it. Well, that's from a mushroom. So I love the idea that here it is, this lowly mushroom can be producing vitamin D, and D2, it works just as well as vitamin D3 in terms of long-term supplementation with it. So, in fact, we're working with one of the top vitamin D researchers in the world right now with the vitamin D, and we're getting ready to really ramp up our production of it, because I just think it's like everybody needs to be supplementing with vitamin D one way or the other. It's and especially those people in the northern climates, we just don't get enough sunlight. So that's really I just think that's so cool. And by the way, in case you're worried about getting the thing your video taken down, you just got to chop it into two parts there, Jason. First part and second part.
I think fortunately in this case the audience isn't quite big enough for it to get taken down, but maybe.
I get it, but the censorship right now is outrageous. It is outrageous, the censorship that's going on in the US especially. I've never seen anything like it. It's absolutely neo-McCarthyism at its worst.
Yeah, it's shocking, and yet, at least for me, I think not at the same time. I mean, I think part of that could have been even the field we're in. It's pretty apparent that there are forces who have, again, for different reasons, but even this thing of prohibition. I mean, there's a very real reason why that exists. The power of government, the power of prohibition, the power of censorship, it serves very particular forces. And I mean, even here in Peru, it was very sad. I don't know if you're familiar, but Peru, according to the statistics, has had one of the highest COVID death rates, and Peru has had one of, if not the strictest lockdown. And I don't think that's a correlation. It's a direct causation. Yeah. People were only allowed to leave their houses in the beginning of the pandemic for almost 5 months. They were only allowed to leave their house for 1 hour a day to go to the indoor grocery store, a pharmacy, or a hospital. And a lot of architecture in Peru, it's very basic. There's no windows. It's these dingy little structures, no airflow, no sunlight.
Horrible.
And it's horrible. And you see where those policies end up creating a tremendous amount of suffering and ultimately death. And it's yeah,
absolutely. Where a lot of people, like in the north, are in their nice Manhattan apartments, sitting back, with their computers, having food delivered to the door, and just still going on. Life just goes on as normal, and it's like, yeah, who gets hit the hardest? It's the lower classes. They're the ones that really get hit the hardest by it, and whose businesses get terminated, and who lose their jobs and all the rest. Yeah, it's been shocking what's gone on, and really, really unfortunate.
Yeah. With the vitamin D supplement, is that a process that you can do with any mushroom, or there's certain mushrooms that are higher in I forget how you called it, ergotamine? Was that the
It's ergosterol. It's like
ergosterol? Uh,
ergosterol. Just when you think of cholesterol, it's a cholesterol. So one is ergocalciferol, the other is cholecalciferol. And you can take your fresh mushrooms, and remember the whole key to it is surface area. So it's not like you can just put the mushroom out there. And if you did, you could put it out there, gills up, and leave it a half hour in direct sunlight, and you would boost up the level to probably of that mushroom to maybe it would give you something like 100 or 200 IUs. But if you were to slice it so you could expose more surface area, you're going to increase it and have that same amount much higher. You're still not going to get up to the levels that I would consider to be important, because the experts would say 5,000 IUs a day is what you should be taking, not I don't know what the level now that the US would say is the standard RDA or something. It'd be 600 IUs or something like that. No, 5,000 would be much better to maintain that high level. I mean, they're just finding out so many things about how important vitamin D is to so many different of our bodily processes. It's just a super important vitamin. And the other thing about mushrooms too, which is interesting, is this other compound called ergothioneine, which is found primarily, one of the major sources of it is mushrooms. It is found to be a very strong antioxidant. We do not create ergothioneine, and yet we find it in a lot of places in our body. And scientists have been trying to figure out exactly why. And these happen to be areas that are high in oxidative stress. So they think, well, okay, this is a pretty important compound. They're even thinking about it as a possible new vitamin. But mushrooms are one of the major sources of ergothioneine. So that's another reason why mushrooms are such a healthful food. And we actually even have a ergothioneine product that we sell in the retail line. I take that every day, actually, 5 milligrams of ergothioneine. And it actually is something that we don't grow yet, because we do not try to extract it specifically. So having 5 milligrams that actually we get from a process that uses yeast to create it. And so I take that every day, and I think ergothioneine, they're calling it a longevity type of product. And I think that's probably one of the other reasons. Mushrooms are just kind of a longevity food, I think. And I think they're, I mean, look at me, I'm 100 years old. What do you think?
Do you think that's why, when you were mentioning this idea of even this more shamanic take of Christmas, for example, the drying of the mushrooms on the tree? I mean, that seems a fairly traditional process of sun drying things. Do you think there was like an inherent wisdom or a knowing that potentially that was enhancing some of the effects of the mushrooms by putting them in the sun like that?
Well, you know what? I'm not sure that was the case, but I have read that with Amanita muscaria, drying it out is important, and somehow it denatures some of the compounds in there that we don't want. And the whole idea of putting it on the tree to dry it, I mean, I've seen that and read about it, and if I were actually really wanted to dry things, I would probably just stick them out face up on a tray, or which is what they do in China. Is they take them out, and I've got pictures of these racks where they've got the shiitake all face up in beautiful rows filling these racks. And if you're there in season, you can be driving through some villages and they've got these racks all along the sides of the roads drying out in the sun. And you think about that, and I think they probably are unaware of the fact that that is actually increasing the vitamin D content of those mushrooms. But that's what it's doing. And unfortunately, as the world goes and mechanizes more and more, of course, what they're doing over there now is having these forced air dryers where, oh yeah, we can put them in there. It's faster. It moves better for our business needs. And so now fewer and fewer of those mushrooms are being actual sun dried like they were in the past. There's still probably a lot of it going on, but they're slowly moving to forced air dryers where it's all inside of just a regular dryer and there's a heat and a fan and all of that. So that's kind of like, you people do not know what you're doing. You've got to leave them in the sun.
Reminds me of driving through India, and on the main road, it's not even on the side of the road, but there'll be like a woman and she takes up half the road just drying her stuff. So you have to go around, and then there's another woman doing it on the other side of the road. So you like zigzag along the road because everyone's just drying their stuff in the road.
That's absolutely right. You see that in China at times where out in the countryside, they're drying out their grain or something, and they just got it on a mat. Or sometimes they even just put it right on the concrete if it's a place where, you know, it's like they can just clean off the concrete and they just lay it down on the concrete to dry out. And you're just like, wow, that is really taking advantage of natural forces, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, direct sunshine, you can't get more direct sunshine. The heat that's coming off that road, it's pretty ingenious.
Yeah. And it's perfect. Oh, thank you very much for putting in this nice new paved road. It's perfect for my drying my products here. Yeah. It is kind of a wonderful thing.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, we're coming up on 3 hours almost, if you can believe it.
I can.
Are there any topics that we didn't get to that you'd like to address?
Well, none that come to mind right now. I mean, it is such a deep topic, all in all. But we covered a lot of ground. I mean, we covered ground that I don't normally cover because I'm not doing that much podcasting with someone like yourself that's dealing with the psychoactive side of things. But more and more, and what's happening now in North America is because of all of the fact of prohibition being lifted, and now doctors can start to use psilocybe mushrooms in their practices. Whether it's psychiatrists or psychologists in Canada, you can actually get a license to utilize psilocybin mushrooms in your practice. In Canada, actually, Health Canada is giving out licenses to companies to actually grow psilocybin mushrooms. In Vancouver, there's actually small stores now you can go into, Jason, and buy encapsulated microdoses of psilocybin mushrooms. Right, walk in off the street into one of these stores. It's just like, Vancouver's always been kind of a place that is on the edge of a lot of that kind of stuff. And look, in Canada, for the most part, in the last 50 years, nobody really went to jail for smoking a joint or having small amounts or anything like that. The only people that went to jail were smugglers. So very different environment in that way. So it's all, in my mind, I'm like, this is a wonderful change. I hope we can maintain it. Which is not always easy. Sometimes the things change, and then all of a sudden they go right back for whatever reason. You know what I mean? So we live in a time where finally seeing prohibition lifted, which I never thought was going to happen, considering, and just the fact that I lived with prohibition for most of my life. And the funny thing is now that we've got the prohibition lifted, for example, of cannabis. I mean, I don't even smoke it anymore. So it's like, I only smoked it when it was illegal. That's, I mean, occasionally I'll have a toke here and there, but not like before where I'm just kind of a daily smoker of it back in the 70s and 80s and things like that. But now, no. And so it's an interesting time in that sense, just like the work that you're doing and being in Peru and another person that I work with, and is a good friend of mine, is Dennis McKenna. So you're probably very aware of Dennis and probably have met him and things like that. And Dennis actually was doing work in the Sacred Valley with a facility there and bringing people down and doing all of that. And he's still actively involved in that and maps and all those types of, I mean, there's lots of conferences and stuff going on these days. And, again, I haven't really kept up on it just because I've just had other things that I'm doing. And our business has just gone absolutely crazy in the last 5 years. Mushrooms have sort of come of age in a sense. It's kind of like that tipping point. I just kind of reached that tipping point about 5 or 6 years ago. And, I mean, God, I've been in the mushroom industry since 1973. And now all of a sudden mushrooms are the thing. And so for me, it's kind of like, yeah, well, I could have told you that a long time ago, but now it's actually happening. And so that's very satisfying in that sense. And I think it's wonderful that they've reached that escape velocity, so to speak. And now there's getting more common. There's lots being written about them and the wonders of them. And so I'm very happy about that. So I think that's a very good sign in every way. And if they ultimately legalize something like, psychoactive mushrooms and other plants, wow, what a wonderful thing. What a wonderful move in the right direction, considering that there's a lot of other moves in the wrong direction. That is one positive area out there. So I'm happy that that's going on. And I love what you're doing and the people that you're interviewing and things like that. I was looking at the whole list of people you were interviewing this morning, and I was going, wow, that is so cool. That's a lot of listening I might have to do here.
Yeah, Dennis is great. He was on, maybe it was episode 32 or 31, something like that. And yeah, he's great. And it's, I think, a real testament to people like Dennis, people like yourself, who have really been pioneers in this field. And it's, I've been interviewed myself recently in a couple podcasts, and I'm doing an interview for a fairly big magazine, I think, upcoming. But it's interesting because I also feel a bit removed from that world. Also, like I'm kind of in a different world. It's still very traditional in a way, and working with people who've been working with these plants for a long time. And when I came down here and started, that world didn't exist where I was coming from. There was nobody doing that kind of stuff. And now I go back and it's like all over the place. And it's like, it feels like I've been in a time warp or something. And, but it is. And I think it's really a testament to people like you, because in the 60s, 70s, how many people were working with mushrooms? Like you said, very few, and really studying that. And, and I think, even these topics like we were talking about, like censorship, it's, in the end, I think truth always does win out. And that's where, in the end, censorship is such a silly thing, or prohibition. It's because you're fighting life. We're fighting forces that are far, far greater than ourselves. And it comes from this scarcity mentality, this fear mentality, this control mentality of trying to regulate and control and put order to things. And I think that's something amazing that these plants do, is they begin to break those, and they begin to literally expand our consciousness and make us look at things in different lights, and hopefully always for not only the better of ourselves, but for community, for life in general. And so I really honor your work. I think it's amazing what you've done. And it was really a pleasure talking to you. These kind of topics I love talking about. Even within this world, I find there's very few people who often think about these things. And again, I think that is changing, but these more ancient aspects that I think have really been overlooked. And it was one of the main things that got me interested in plant medicine, was this real fascination of history and anthropology and archaeology and astronomy. And it just seemed to me there was a story that we had forgotten. And it's fascinating because I didn't even realize before I started studying with a lot of these more ancient indigenous cultures that they have the same story. It wasn't something new. It had been there all along. And I think this rediscovery, in a way, like you said, it's like, yeah, I could have told you that, 30 years ago. And it's we're in a way, we're remembering these things. And I think it's great what you're doing, and just all of the value of mushrooms, just on a nutritional level, on a medicinal level. It seems like there's so much potential there. And as we were talking about, even on a deeper level, like this act of what it means to be a human being, these mushrooms are really gifts, and they give us that potentiality. So I really thank you. And if you're up for it sometime, I'd love to do part 2, because I especially that more ancient kind of worldview, interdisciplinary stuff. I find that fascinating, and I'd love to sit down and talk to you some other time if you're up for it.
Oh, I absolutely am. And again, that gets back to the way I look at things, and that is, I feel like I'm going back to the future. Terence McKenna actually called it the archaic revival, and I totally agree with that. I mean, we are going back and revisiting a lot of that, and that's where, to some degree, the classical education focused on a lot of that kind of information. And now it's like, no, you can't get a job in that. You got to go into science or something, So yeah, and I'd love to do that. I mean, I really enjoyed myself, Jason, and I'm really happy to be able to have met you, and we'll definitely stay in touch.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, Jeff. I really appreciate this.
You're very welcome, Jason. Thank you.
All right, everybody, that is it. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Jeff. It was really a pleasure for me to have Jeff on to share in all of his life experience and knowledge. I felt like I was with a kindred soul in Jeff. So I really hope you all enjoyed this episode of the podcast. Consider checking out Jeff's work too, his companies. The more I really thought about it and kind of pondered what he was saying, I think there's a lot of merit to that, and there's just really a growing science and a remembering in a way of all of the benefits that not only mushrooms but that nature has to offer. So I really think he's doing great work, and the company he has, if you're interested in buying mushrooms, I would highly recommend that. So I think that's it. My next episode should be with a gentleman here in the Sacred Valley of Peru. His name is Alonso del Rio. He's an ayahuasquero, quite a well-known ayahuasquero who lives here. He's been doing this work for a long time, I believe since the 70s. He studied with one of the very great Shipibo curanderos, and really just a wealth of knowledge, and a really fascinating guy. I just finished that interview. It went really well. I think you all will get a lot out of that interview. So that'll be the following week. And then after that, I'm actually not sure. But as always, I hope to bring on some really interesting people. So as always, if you are able to support this podcast, that's a really big help to me. Patreon is a really good way. It's a subscription service for as little as $1 a month. You can sign up. There's different tiers you can sign up for. They give you some things back, like early access to shows, bonus material, Q&As. That's a really big help to me to continue to be able to make and produce this show. To all the people who have done that, thank you very much. As always, I really appreciate all of your support. There's also the option to donate via PayPal, and with the YouTube channel, there's the option to join the channel via YouTube, which gives you a lot of the same perks as the Patreon option. If you're not able to do that, helping with the algorithms is always a really big help. If you're watching on YouTube, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the video, leaving comments in the comment section, sharing the videos with your friends, family. If you're listening with the audio version, going on Apple Podcasts, leaving a star rating, a short review, following the show. Also, I believe with Spotify now, there's the option to rate the show. I believe if you hit, there's under the logo of the podcast, there should be 3 little dots. And if you hit that, it should give you the option to rate the show as well. So I think that's it. Thank you all for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, and I will see you all on the next episode.